Hi everybody, welcome back. This is Clémence with the Gourmandise School, here to talk to you about yeast. Yeast is a one-celled asexual organism that likes to replicate itself when it's got food and oxygen and water and some warmth, and then it splits into two yeast cells and produces a gas called carbon dioxide. When you are looking at a piece of bread, see over here all these holes, know that two things happen to create those holes. When the bread dough was rising, the gases caused by yeast replicating itself and producing gas tried to escape. So all that gas is much lighter than your bread dough, and it tried to get out of your bread dough. But the gluten proteins that you needed and developed into that webbing trapped all that gas and made the dough rise. You get these holes again in the oven when the water that's trapped in your bread dough turns to steam and tries to get out of your bread. And again, the gluten proteins expand to capture them if you used a really strong flour and if you kneaded your dough really well. But back to yeast. When you're at the store and you're looking to buy yeast, you have a couple of options. The first is active dry yeast. So when you're buying yeast at the store, it's always vacuum sealed. It's very dry unless you're buying fresh cake yeast. And that's because yeast will stay dormant and inactive so long as it doesn't get those three things it needs to wake up, which is water, oxygen, and sugar. So yeast is usually bought in a 3-pack like this that each weigh about 7 grams. This is active dry yeast. It works more slowly than rapid rise yeast. And then over here, we have another kind of vacuum sealed pack. So you can buy it in a packet like this, in a jar, or like this, but all of them are vacuum sealed so that your yeast doesn't start working before you need it. Now, your recipes are usually asking you to take yeast in powdered form like this, or fresh cake yeast, and to crumble it up, and to mix it with some liquid and some sugar. Because again, yeast needs 3 things to wake up: water, oxygen, food. The recipes that call for adding a lot of sugar in the beginning are going to be the recipes that yield you a bread within 2.5 to 3 hours. So they're front loading a lot of energy and a lot of sugar in the beginning to wake that yeast up really fast, and then it'll crash later on. So it's a recipe that's timed for a very short window. You have some recipes that tell you to mix a little bit of yeast with some water or some milk, and then all the other ingredients, the flour and the salt, and to put it in the refrigerator overnight. Those recipes usually have a lot less sugar in the beginning because they want the yeast to grow really, really slowly. So yeast has a metabolism like you and I do. Its metabolism speeds up when it's warm or it gets a lot of sugar, and it slows down when it's cold or it has less food available in the beginning. This is why when you buy fresh cake yeast in those little blocks, it only has a shelf life of about 2 weeks, because even though it comes from the same factory as this, it still contains water, and water keeps it slightly active until you crumble it up into more liquid that the recipe calls for. So this and this are both made in a lab by fermenting sugar. So is fresh cake yeast. It forms a foam that is then compacted into a little cube. That's the fresh cake yeast, or freeze dried into a powder, which is this. So if you've ever bought rapid rise yeast, it's the same thing as this. It just has a little bit more sugar in it, and it's really finely ground, and it works about 50% faster. So I'm going to set these aside now and talk to you about wild yeast, because those are cultivated yeasts grown in a lab. And that's an invention that's only about 100 years old, a little bit more than 100 years. Before that, all bread in the world was leavened naturally. So if you've ever been to a really great bakery and seen naturally leavened pain au levain or sourdough bread, those are breads that were risen with wild yeast. So this is a jar of my sourdough starter. I have a couple different jars kind of all over, but it's a very, very simple thing, because yeast lives everywhere. Yeast lives on my hand, it lives in the flour, it lives in the air. And in order to make my own sourdough starter, all I did was to take a little bit of water and a little bit of flour and mix them up so they look like thick pancake syrup, thick pancake batter. Syrup's a whole other class. And then I let it sit for a day, and then took half of it out and gave it some more water and flour, and repeated that process for about 3 or 4 days until I saw a lot of bubbles. And those bubbles mean fermentation is taking place, and that is going to be what helps to leaven your bread. So when I'm making sourdough bread, I only use about a tablespoon of this stuff, but it takes me a lot more time to let it grow. The main difference between a sourdough starter bread recipe and one that calls for this stuff here is time. The longer it takes for your yeast to grow, the more flavor you're going to develop, and the better that bread is for you for a lot of other factors that we'll talk about during bread camp. But you can't use this for a sourdough bread recipe. It doesn't work. They're not interchangeable. So wild yeast is just a petri dish of the yeast that's kind of all around everywhere, and you've given that yeast everything it needs to get excited: water, food, oxygen. And so when I'm making sourdough bread, instead of sprinkling commercial yeast and waiting 30 minutes and then mixing everything and 3 hours later I've got bread, I'm taking about a tablespoon of sourdough starter, mixing it with a little bit of water and flour, and waiting 6 hours. And then I take that and I add it to the bulk of the flour and water that's going to make up my bread dough, mix it up, add some salt, and then wait another 6 to 12 hours. And then I shape my bread, and it takes 3 hours at room temperature or 8 to 12 hours in the fridge to rise really slowly, and then I bake it. So the main difference between wild yeast and cultivated yeast is time and activation. If you have any more questions about yeast, please email our hotline at hotline@thegourmandiseschool.com. We are manning the hotline 24 hours a day at this point. We are loving your questions. It's why we're taking all this online. And we hope that you'll join us starting Monday for bread camp. Have a great day. Bye.